want to talk today about Gottfried Leibniz and to talk about the way that Leibniz relates to the discipline of geography. As much as Leibniz is known in geography, this seems to be largely in terms of the relational view of space that he is said to have proposed in opposition to the Newtonian view of absolute space, particularly as you find it in the correspondence between Leibniz and Samuel Clarke, with Samuel Clarke standing in as a kind of representative of Newton in this debate. Leibniz is also known for his work as a mathematician, on calculus, on binary notation, and so on. His work as a metaphysician, particularly the monadology, a late work of his, and for the claim that we live in the best of all possible worlds, a claim we find in his late work on the Theodicy, which of course was the one that was satirized by Voltaire. More recently, perhaps, Leibniz has been noticed by geographers partly through the reading that Gilles Deleuze suggested in the book The Fold, or through the work that Leibniz has done on what has become the branch of mathematics known as topology. Even though these are reasons why people might be aware of Leibniz within geography, it seems to me that he is very little read in geography. Even some of the people that mobilise some of his ideas reference maybe one or two works at most, but often don't even refer to those works. So there is, for instance, work using Leibniz supposedly simply through Deleuze's reading of Leibniz rather than through Leibniz himself. But what I'm going to talk about today is none of that. I want to talk about what I'm calling here another Leibniz. The possibility that we find in his work for a whole range of questions that relate to the way that we understand geography today that have nothing to do with those more traditional ways, perhaps, of understanding his work. And this is to suggest that if we look at the Leibniz of the collected works in German, a project that's begun in 1923 and still isn't finished, and is going to be a huge number of volumes, over 100 volumes in total of these writings of his work, we find a Leibniz who is a geologist, a paleontologist, a biologist, a historian, a politician, somebody who's working on behalf of politicians and acting as their advisor and writing works of political theory, and perhaps I'm going to suggest a political geographer as well. And there's a number of recent works of secondary literature, and the two I want to mention, Maria Rosa Antagnas's superlative biography of Leibniz, and a wonderful book by Justin Smith called Divine Machines, which looks at Leibniz and the sciences of life. So there are people working on Leibniz within philosophy that are opening up some of these other parts of his work compared to perhaps the more familiar, the mathematician and the metaphysician notion of Leibniz. The first work I want to say a little bit about is a work that Leibniz gave this a very non-snappy title of a dissertation on the origin of the most ancient state of natural things in the Brunsberg-Lüneburg regions, an area of Germany. It actually got published after Leibniz's death, about 30 years after his death, as the Proto-Gaia, or the early Earth, effectively. It's a prehistory of the Earth, and it's a work that encompasses what we would now call geology and paleontology, to try to outline how the things that he finds in a particular region of Germany open up a set of wider questions people might be interested in generally. And what he talks about in that work is what he calls a new science called natural geography. And it really is a work that delivers on this claim. It's a work that looks at, for instance, the question of fossils, and you have here some of the illustrations from the book. The fossils of what became known, people discovered, were actually shark's teeth, but had been known in the Middle Ages and antiquity as tongue stones. They looked like stones in the shape of a tongue, and that this gave rise to the idea that these were stones that had been created through a peculiar set of natural processes, but that they were not actually the organic or the inorganic remains of organic life, which was a question that came up later. There's also a lot of work on geological questions and in the mines that he was working in. And this is important to remember. Leibniz was a philosopher as we understand him today, but he was actually employed by the Hanoverian royal family, the branch of the Brunswick part of the family. And the two of the main tasks that he was given was one to write the family history, and the other one was to supervise their mining operation in the Harz Mountains. Now Leibniz tended to develop all of the projects that he had much bigger than their initial aims, and he decided that the best way to write the history of the family was initially to go back deep into the Middle Ages to start to trace the emergence of the modern family, 17th, 18th century that he was writing. But then he decided actually what he needed to do was to write a prehistory of the very places that they came from, which is what led him into this early work on geology and paleontology. And he also worked as a mining engineer. He was somebody that went to the mines where the family had mineral rights, and he advised them on more effective ways to make these mines profitable, to actually gain things for the family through this process. And Leibniz invented various types of mining equipment and tried to come up with new ways that they could exploit the resources that they were finding in this area. And so he uses the kind of what he called the documents, the fossils, the geological things that he found in this work, almost as he used the historical documents in writing the history of the family, that these for him were the raw material through which he could construct the kind of history that he wants to write, both of people, but also of natural processes, and so on. So he talks about this, and I'm not going to read all of these quotes out, but this is the idea of that the particular place that he's working in, the one that the family has tasked him for working in, is an area that's especially rich in a set of natural resources. But that what he's talking about, and this is the important thing I think in the last aim, is that this is going to be a detailed, specific work of a particular site, but that in so doing he might open up broader questions that would be of interest to people looking at more universal ways of understanding the origins of life and the origins of physical processes. And one of the things that I find very interesting in this text is the work on fossils. Leibniz, in earlier writings, had actually bought into the medieval idea that fossils were games of nature, that they were things that were produced through some kind of peculiar natural process that had created things in resemblance of life, rather than in the actual understanding that these were the remains of life at some point in the past. So that he tries to understand why there might be shells on top of mountains, for instance. And the problem that he comes up with is in an early unpublished manuscript. He says that if this was actually so, if these were actually to do with the sea being at this place, or that these were the remains of these creatures that maybe didn't exist anymore in the world, then the earth would have to be much older than it's suggested in the Bible or in other accounts. And so he falls back on this idea of the game of nature, or the play of nature, some kind of peculiar natural process that creates these. But by the time he gets to the Protogaea, which he writes in the 1690s, he's discovered so much empirical material that he's actually changed his mind. And I think this is an important thing to recognise in Leibniz, that he is somebody who is able to be persuaded both by the things that he discovers, but also by the kinds of conversations that he has with people. So that he knew Nicholas Steno, for instance, an important paleontologist, and was persuaded by some of the arguments that Steno made about how these natural processes actually created these things out of previously organic nature. So here he's talking about how he's finding fossilised remains of particular kinds of fish, and that he can understand the way that these have been created, not now as this kind of playful jest of the great architect, the idea of kind of God maybe, or some kind of natural force creating these, but actually understanding that these are the products of organic nature being transformed through these processes. But he makes mistakes, and the one that people regularly laugh at is his attempted reconstruction of a unicorn skeleton out of a number of bones that they found in various mines, and it's just mixing up a whole range of things and trying to reconstruct it. But what's quite interesting about it, I think, is that it is an attempt at reconstruction on the basis of the empirical data that's presented to him. So even though he makes a mistake, the idea of combining the empirical detail and the rationalization is an interesting thing, and I think makes more sense of Leibniz to some of the ways he's understood. And there was another example of a creature that was found that people suggested was a unicorn, and Leibniz actually said, no, it's a goat, but with deformed horns. And so Leibniz was able to take this example, and this is one of the things that relates to his interest in biology, and actually say that, you know, this thing that people have found as a living unicorn, so-called, was something that you could clearly disprove if you actually looked at what the creature was, if you analysed it in relation to other creatures that existed, and so on. And in Justin Smith's book, he goes through a number of such examples from Leibniz's correspondence and writings. His interest in alchemy, in orangutans, in race, in machines, in vivisection, in bodily fluids, and there's a lovely sentence where he says, "You would not expect to learn much about a philosopher from their interest in vomit, but even here Leibniz surprises us." So there's this generalised sense that Leibniz is interested in a far wider range of things than people would ordinarily have given him credit for. But again, a passage from the 1690s, where he's saying that actually the kinds of things that we need to be interested in go much broader than simply natural history, and that we need to look at the whole range of human history, the whole range of questions and issues that are important, particularly in terms of the historical writing that he's embarking on for the Hanoverian family, but also that these, and a whole range of material artifacts, documents, traces of things, can give us insight into these kinds of important questions about the family. And he's also talking about the relation to law, the relation to politics, and just showing the breadth of the interests that Leibniz has in his work and in the questions that he's concerned with. And this big history of the family that I've mentioned wasn't published until about 120 years after his death. But when it was published, it was 2,300 pages of material that was produced in this work. This is the annals of the Western Empire in relation to the branch of the Brunswick family of this, the Holy Roman Empire, and the history of this. And the documentary material takes somebody 100 or so years after his death before this is able to be produced. But this is based on the material that Leibniz has created. But in his lifetime, he produced a number of works, mainly works of documents being brought together, edited together, of documents that he found in the archives that were important and still remain important source material for historians of this period. And some of these are of enormous length. Some of these are in multiple volumes. There's supplementary volumes themselves in several volumes, and so on. And then there were people after Leibniz died who again made use of materials that he'd gathered in order to produce further volumes that came out. 5 volumes of the origins of the Guelph dynasty, but also in the body of work on the Middle Ages, the history of the Middle Ages. 2 volumes, but each of those volumes is over 2,000 pages. So an enormous amount of historical material that he gathers through the time that he's working on those questions. And what's interesting is that if Leibniz hadn't written all the other things, he'd probably still be remembered as an important historian. But we tend to forget that he was an important historian because all of the other things that he worked on have kind of eclipsed that in terms of the way that we understand him, his importance. I just want to say briefly a couple of things about Leibniz as a political theorist. I've made this argument before, and in relation to the work I've been doing on the question of territory, that Leibniz is a greatly neglected political theorist who's an extremely important thinker of a whole set of questions, particularly I found in relation to the question of the relation of sovereignty and territory. Leibniz is working for the Duke of Hanover also as one of his political advisors, and Leibniz writes briefing documents, some of which become works of several hundred pages, trying to analyse the particular politics and the political geographies of the Holy Roman Empire at the time that he's working for the Duke of Hanover. The Duke of Hanover says to him, in the wake of the treaties of Westphalia, what do I have? What kind of power do I have? And Leibniz says, you are the master of a territory. You are the sovereign who is master of a territory. And that relation between sovereignty and territory seems to be an important part of Leibniz's life and writings. He also writes a briefing document for Louis XIV of France, suggesting that Louis XIV shouldn't attack Holland, but he should actually colonize Egypt. And it's an attempt to suggest, he says at one point, that Egypt is the Holland of the East, which is a kind of peculiar way of describing the place. But he suggests that geostrategically, this is an extremely important region of the world, one that should actually be the concentration of where Louis should direct his foreign policy. And 100 years or so later, after Napoleon has conquered Egypt as part of his campaigns, this document was translated into English with the suggestion that Leibniz had been the kind of the secret power behind this, that had been the reason why Napoleon had made this a conquest of that. Unlike most Western philosophers, Leibniz also had an interest in China. He was very interested in Chinese history, Chinese philosophy, and wrote this preface to a collection of writings of the news from China, of the kind of travel reports that were being sent back to Western Europe from people that were travelling in those areas. And so Leibniz, it seems, has got a whole range of questions that he's interested in, including here what might be called a kind of geostrategic sense of how we might understand the world and the relation of different parts of the world generally. And Leibniz said even in his own lifetime, although this was actually published after his death, that he who knows me only from my publications does not know me. That the vast majority of Leibniz's work was not published in his lifetime, and actually there's a huge amount of it still not published today, even 3 centuries after his death. That Leibniz and all this material on Leibniz, I think, is vastly under-analysed, neglected. It's not known by people who are interested in these questions. But just from that very quick snapshot overview, I think we can see a case where Leibniz is somebody who has an interest in questions across the whole range of what we now call geography. Not just human geography, but from the geology, the paleontology, through to the historical political set of questions. But there's formidable challenges in terms of how we might understand Leibniz, how we might think about Leibniz, and this is partly in terms of the material, it's partly in terms of the languages that he wrote in. Latin was the major language he wrote in, but he also wrote in French, German, Italian, Dutch, and English. So there's the daunting kind of work to be done for somebody who really wants to pursue this, rather than the more overview project that I've just outlined here today. So this is what I'm meaning by the question of another Leibniz. Thank you.